Hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. I hope it was good. And I hope you are ready now for our next speaker, Kevin Fu, who will present his talk about a very critical environment. It's about medical devices. Give a warm applause for Mr. Fu.
All right. Thank you. So let's see. How many people here are engineers? Okay. Any clinicians? Let's see. Anyone with a medical device? I knew you'd raise your hand. Great. Okay. So this is going to be, I'll get into a little bit of technology toward the end, but I'm mostly going to talk about the human side of medical device computer security and why there have been some stumbling blocks along the way. But I'm going to take you just very quickly, 10 years in 30 seconds. About 10 years ago, I started going around basically dumpster diving for pacemakers and defibrillators and trying to get my way into operating rooms to interact with clinicians to understand, so how do they keep their systems secure from internet-based threats and computer-based threats like malware? And so a couple years later, so in 2006, I visited the FDA to talk about security in medical devices, and there were basically 3 people who showed up. And they kind of go, that's cute, and then nothing really happened. Until about 2008, where I co-led a study, here's the cover page from that study, where we showed how to wirelessly induce a fatal heart rhythm in implanted defibrillators. So we could cause it to emit a shock using a little transmitter that we made. That was real, except it was done in a laboratory setting. And then in around 2013, there was this resurgence. A number of security researchers started to look at devices like insulin pumps. The latest has been in infusion pumps. I'll tell you a little bit about these devices. But the hype kicked in a little bit in 2013 because there's a famous TV show in the US. I haven't seen it myself. It's called, actually, maybe somebody will know what it's called. It was the one... Homeland, yeah, Homeland. I don't have a TV, so people just tell me about these things, and I find them on the internet. But they had created this plot around a vice president who was being attacked through his defibrillator. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, too. A little bit about my lab. I'm a researcher. I'm also an entrepreneur, so I have a startup company in computer security. But these are a few of my students working on our electronics equipment. We're mostly embedded people working with RF and acoustics. Analyzing medical devices. Here's a more interesting one. Anyone want to guess what we're infusing? Beer? No, I'd be in the Krankenhaus or whatever it's called. Any other guesses? Pig blood? No. Okay. I'm half Asian, so. Dialysis? Well, there's a lot of sugar in there. It's soy sauce, actually. But we needed something with good contrast, so we're using soy sauce in our infusion pumps. But what I like to do with my students, if anyone here is thinking about getting into the business, either the business or the research side of medical device security, you need to be with the clinicians. You need to go where the action's happening. Otherwise, you're going to have this whiteboard sort of understanding of computer security, very academic, very textbook, and you won't understand the real problems. So every year I bring my students into the operating room. I bring them into pediatric surgery. I have them watch the surgeries. They see it. They smell it. They sense everything. Because if you don't, you really don't truly understand the problems going on inside those clinical facilities. So we're going to go through just a bunch of examples of sort of hacker hype. Well, yes, a defibrillator was hacked. Whoops, sorry about that. But it was in our laboratory. It took about 2 years to do this, 10 years ago. Started in 2006. Took a couple years. Got our first result in 2007, but didn't tell anybody about it. For about a year. We worked with the FDA and the manufacturer, and then in 2008, we actually published it. But basically what we did was we used a software radio, one of the early USRPs, in order to generate a signal, a replay attack rather. We recorded a command that would induce a fatal heart rhythm, and then we played it back. The good news is that particular device isn't manufactured anymore, so you don't really have to worry about this attack. The newer devices, they are beginning to use these threat models in their design, but you're going to be seeing these changes happening over a long period of time. It typically takes about 10 years for a product to go to concept to actual deployment in the marketplace for medical devices. Now, there is a very good reason for having wireless control of an implant. This is a picture from the Medtronic Museum, one of the larger manufacturers of medical devices, of a pacemaker that did not have wireless control. So anyone like to guess what the little wire is coming out the right-hand side? What's the function of that? Go ahead. Internet?
Console?
No.
Management console?
Management console, kind of. You might know the answer, yes?
Adjusting the settings.
Adjusting the settings. And how to adjust the settings?
I guess it has to be outside the body if it's not wireless.
Right, right. So in the old days, yeah, exactly. So be glad you have the wireless, maybe. But in the old days, the physician would ask the patient, please lift up your arm. You'd plunge a needle through the armpit, and then you'd twist a potentiometer to change the heart rate. And so this had obvious risks of infection. This is the kind of thing you wouldn't really pick up on with a textbook. But this is one of the main reasons why they deployed RF controls, because it mitigated a clear risk. Patients would be subject to infection, and sometimes that can be fatal. So it's a very good thing to introduce wireless. The trouble is, of course, when you introduce wireless, you also introduced security threats. Okay, hacker hype. Darth Vader is an FDA-regulated medical device. Yes or no? Actually, I was just at South by Southwest, this conference in Texas, and I saw this guy wearing a Darth Vader outfit next to that sign. I couldn't help but take this photograph. Hard hat requires. But no, he is, of course, not an FDA-regulated device, but he is a medical device, and he is perhaps the first hacked medical device, because here you can see somebody hacking Vader's neuroprosthetic arms, throwing the Emperor into some kind of tunnel. But I do like to use Star Wars analogies. So I'll just make one little comment about, have you heard about the crypto debate going on in the US? Perhaps? Okay. I'm not sure how that news is filtering out outside of our country, but we're currently debating in our country whether or not to have sort of backdoor access into cryptographic systems for law enforcement. And it's a very complicated debate. Anyhow, there's my take on it. Okay. So I often hear in the media or in blogs, oh, the medical device manufacturers aren't doing anything about security. This is actually false. Anytime you see an absolute statement, it's probably pretty clear it's false. Or if you go to today's keynote talk, always be skeptical of anything you read, including my talk. This is false. I know this is false because I teach courses at medical device manufacturers, many of them. This is just one example. But what you're finding now at medical device manufacturers, they're actually bringing in experts to teach the engineers who are not only building the devices, but designing the devices, how to integrate security in the very beginning, how to build it in. And this is really surprising to me as a security researcher, because for decades, it's sort of been a battle with the industry. We would often discover a vulnerability, we'd show how to break into a contactless credit card, and then there would be a lot of denial, people would get upset. But what I was surprised about in the medical community is that not all, but many of the manufacturers took it seriously. It took them a while, but they're beginning to take it seriously. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I think we have a microphone. Oh, right, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Now, that isn't to say all manufacturers are sort of doing the right thing. The interesting thing about a manufacturer is, what is a manufacturer? A manufacturer is a big organization. Who works for a big organization? A third of you? Okay. So if I were to walk, wait, raise your hands again. Okay. So if I were to walk into your company, and ask, is security important? What would the answer be? Yes. Yes, because you're a security company? Okay. But if I were to walk into your company and ask, what is the most important feature of the product? Might get different answers from different people. So medical device manufacturers have lots of people. And so if you talk to one person, you'll get one answer. But if you talk to somebody else, you might get a different answer. So for computer security, if you talk to a frontline engineer, I generally get very good responses. But if I talk to an executive, more often than not, they just haven't been sort of educated in how to interpret computer security in typical sort of business speak. So there's often a disconnect in the management chain within these big companies, and it takes a really long time to help, basically, they bring in third parties to help translate conversations between the engineers and the executive management. Okay. If for those of you who were out really late last night at the brewery, so do you think this is true or false? Dental X-ray monitors that serve beer ads. True. Okay.
Hopefully.
False. Hopefully. Okay. Why do you think it's true? Did you have beer while you were getting your teeth worked on, or?
No, but I know that I've seen people operating these dental X-ray machines with two left hands and no clue what they're doing.
Okay, so you think they're drinking beer is your...
No.
Okay. Well, just to warm you up on that, here's a picture from a German restaurant in Michigan, where I'm from. They like good German beer, and so to make fun of all American beers, they put all the American beer posters in a very convenient location to indicate what to do with it. Anyhow, this is true. And I know this firsthand. It's true because I saw a Dos Equis ad pop up during my x-rays. Okay, so when this popped up, I knew I couldn't stop. I said, hold on, I need to take a picture. So this is a picture of my teeth. And I was hearing music during while the x-rays were going on, and I saw this Dos Equis ad pop up, and I said, why is there Dos Equis over my x-rays? And the hygienist said, oh, we're using Pandora. So here they are running Pandora on the same machine that's interfacing with the x-rays. You can see all the other browser tabs that are open, but it's not quite as bad as running everything as root, but it does violate that same sort of principle. So yes, this has actually happened, and I would not be surprised if people have gotten malware on those machines.
Are you still with that dentist?
I am still with that dentist because I want to see the ad again. Okay. Has FDA issued warnings on security or privacy on medical devices? Yes. This is true, and it happens to be against what's called an infusion pump. There are many different kinds of drug pumps. An infusion pump is the most general. I'll show you a picture. This is a picture. So Billy Rios and a number of other researchers are well known for some work on infusion pumps. This is just one example. On the inside, you'll find a pumping mechanism. We have many of these in my laboratory where we work on protecting these kinds of systems. But what was interesting was Billy submitted a vulnerability report to the manufacturer, and it took about 1.5 years before he got a meaningful response. Now, if you were doing a typical vulnerability report and it took 1.5 years for a manufacturer to get back to you, what would you do? Publish it? Go to Troopers. Submit it to Troopers. Yeah. So the medical community hasn't yet adapted and hasn't yet learned how to interface with security vulnerability reporting. Some companies have, but most of them still think more about, well, we only accept reports from clinicians, so why would anyone else need to submit a report? That's where we get all of our reports, from hospitals. So when you have a new stakeholder coming in, it really changes the thinking, and it's not that they don't like you, it's just that they hadn't really thought of that. They hadn't really planned for computer security. But the sad part about this particular device, by the way, that's the FDA product advisory. It's technically not a recall, but they basically said, if you can, we advise that you stop using these pumps. Let me tell you how easy it is or hard it is to break into the system. If you telnet to port 23, you get a root shell. Okay, that's the attack. You got to have some real skills. You got to know how to type telnet. They had hard-coded local accounts. The other kicker, slightly more sophisticated, was that the Wi-Fi keys for the secure Wi-Fi were stored unencrypted on the pump. So if someone breaks into that pump and that pump's on a critical hospital network, well, guess what? Now you can be part of that hospital network and then compromise the rest of the hospital system. So I have a short video here from the news in the US that'll describe sort of this in a little more detail.
To a threat we have never before seen, a common medical device found in so many hospital rooms could be vulnerable to a cyber attack. The FDA warning hospitals be on alert for hackers. Here's ABC's Aditi Roy.
Hospitals across the country receiving an unprecedented warning by the FDA tonight that a commonly used medical device may be at risk of getting hacked. The device, Hospira's Symbic infusion pump, is used to deliver medications like painkillers and cancer treatments to patients through an IV. In its warning, the FDA says an unauthorized user with malicious intent could access the pump remotely and modify the dosage it delivers.
So every hospital should assume that its devices, if connected to the internet, can be attacked. And so it's an important warning. This is not an isolated incident.
So that was John Halamka. He's the Chief Information Officer, and the Chief Information Security Officer reports to him at a fairly famous hospital in Boston called Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. It's famous because it's been attacked many times, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the attacks he had to go through. But does FDA have a way to report security vulnerabilities? Technically, they do. It's sort of half true, but they're kind of working on it. Now, I'm known for sort of causing trouble, so I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had some students reverse engineer the firmware on an automated external defibrillator that you'll see in the hallways and in police cars. And he created a proof of concept worm that broke into the firmware, and it was actually multi-operating system malware. It would spread from the custom firmware to the Windows machine of the safety officer back and forth. We denatured it so it wouldn't spread, but it worked. And was able to change the operation of that defibrillator. So I submitted that report to FDA as a security vulnerability through the only way to send in reports. It's called the MedWatch 3500 form. And I'm sorry, this is a very US-centric thing, and even people in the US don't know what a MedWatch 3500 form is. But this is how you report a safety incident in a hospital if a medical device accidentally injures a patient. It took about a year for FDA to respond. And I used to work at FDA, so I knew a little bit about how things worked, so I could go and contact my colleagues and say, so how's that report coming through? Is it through yet? And it took about a year. I can say now, this is a drop-down menu of when you want to search through all the public reports of different adverse events. You can sort it by problem, and they finally have added computer system security issue. It's called FDA MAUD is the database. There's a new one that's replacing MAUD. But if you go search on computer security issue, you'll find about 3 reports. And they're all about the security of screws used in bone grafting. A physician had accidentally misunderstood that security didn't mean sort of intentional threats, but the security of the screw coming loose from the bone. So that it's not exactly very effective yet. But FDA is holding some meetings. Maria and I were there, actually. Here's one of the panels that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration held on computer security. They had 2 different workshops lasting a total of about 4 days. It's really grown. There were, I think, on the order of 400 people there, and over 1,500 people signed up to watch the online live broadcast. So it grew from about 3 people in 2006 to almost 2,000 people now when we have some kind of event. FDA has released, and I'm sorry again, I'm going to speak from a US perspective because I'm from the US, but also many of the regulatory agencies around the world do look to the US Food and Drug Administration, and they watch what the FDA does before they implement their regulatory guidance, usually. So FDA issued what's called pre-market guidance. This is, they basically told manufacturers, here are the things we will look for when you submit a device for approval onto the market. If you want to have a new device go onto the market and sell it, here's what we're going to ask about your product. Things like, what are the cybersecurity risks? Really basic stuff. How are you mitigating those risks? And by the way, how are you measuring that your compensating controls are remaining effective? This is really basic stuff. Notice I didn't even mention any technology, but it sort of shows a lot of companies are a little bit behind the ball, a little bit slow compared to the IT community, and so they're beginning with these very simple principles. But before this document, it was a much worse world. I took this picture in Washington, D.C. outside the the FDA event, and I felt like it really described life before the document. Their old document was a one-pager that just said, everybody get along. It just said, hospitals, medical device manufacturers, just get along and keep things secure. Go team, yeah. And so, of course, nobody picks up the crap. And it just stays there. But it's getting better. Earlier this year, FDA released a second document called post-market guidance. That's what do you do after something goes wrong that you didn't expect. What happens when there's an exploit? What happens when you discover a vulnerability that you just didn't expect? And they go through a number of processes about how they recommend manufacturers to receive these kind of vulnerability reports. To give you an idea about how medical companies think about computer security, they try to translate safety language into security language. And just so you know, there's a lot more safety people than security people in the world. So you might think, because we're here at Troopers, everybody knows security, but in reality, there's more safety people, and they don't understand security necessarily. So they think of security as the following, that you have threats and vulnerabilities, and if a vulnerability, if there's a threat that arises for a vulnerability, it could become an exploit. But an exploit alone does not necessarily cause harm. Just like in the case of the infusion pump that had the product advisory, nobody was killed, nobody was injured as far as we know, but there was an exploit. But there was no evidence of harm. The further down the line you are in this risk scenario, the more likely there's going to be a recall issued. If you haven't seen harm, it's highly unlikely there's going to be a recall in the US. But what they do is they will issue advisories before harm has occurred. And there's two terms that are used from the safety world. A compensating control. That's fancy speak for technology to reduce the risk. So for instance, you're using clear text telnet. A compensating control is SSH. It's not rocket science, but to people in the safety community, they might not be familiar with all the tools that you're familiar with. So you'll end up deploying these safety controls at all these different points strategically to mitigate risks that the manufacturer comes up with during the design process. And now because the threats change and evolve, we all know the threats change and evolve, they recommend sort of this continuous measurement, and so you look at all these different stages to see if whatever control you have deployed is still working well. Because if you don't observe it, if you don't watch for it, you might fall into the trap of thinking, I threw some technology at this, and now I don't need to worry. And so they like to put in that continuous measurement. Okay, moving on a little bit. So have hospitals been disabled by malware?
Yes.
Yeah, oh yeah, we're in Germany, that's right. Yes, many, many times. So in California, I had to revise these slides because I made them in February, and then a bunch more hospitals got hacked, so I had to revise this. So there's a hospital in California that was held for ransom. They ended up paying, well, I'll show you the video.
You can't tell from the outside, but officials say one of Hollywood's largest hospitals is under attack. For the past 7 days, computers have been shut down
for a week
as the FBI and LAPD work to catch the cyber criminals who they say hacked the hospital system.
I wasn't feeling very well, went in for a checkup, and they said that their computers are down. I go, what's going on here? And they go, well, we were hacked.
Melissa Garza is one of the hundreds of patients still being treated at the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center.
So I went to go get a prescription, and then later they said that their systems were down.
While the hospital says patient care hasn't been compromised, they admit the hack has impacted their day-to-day operations, causing some holdups in the emergency room. That's where Jeff Wilkinson says his daughter has been waiting for hours.
I'm kind of actually surprised that they wouldn't, tell us this when we were coming in, that there might be some sort of delay because of the situation.
This hack attack is not a usual one. We want to know, why did these hackers choose a hospital, and how hard would it be to hack into the system? So we took the...
All right. So what went on there? This is your typical ransomware attack. I don't know exactly how it got in. My guess would be somebody clicked on a link. I run a workshop every year. We're going to be doing the 4th medical device security workshop this coming May. And the White House tells me they're going to be sending someone from the FBI involved with these kinds of ransomware matters to teach the people there about what happened, maybe not at that particular hospital, but anonymized hospitals, to understand how not to repeat those kind of mistakes. I can tell you, I work with a lot of hospitals in Michigan, and when they heard about this, the first thing is check your backups. Everybody check your backups, right? Because hospitals are relatively good at having backup systems. You'll see a diesel generator outside typically. But my guess with Presbyterian, my guess would be that they probably had offline backups that were online. That's my guess. Because I can't think of another way that the ransomware could have compromised their backup systems. They ended up paying $17,000 US in bitcoins in order to get the decryption key. Of course, it's happened here too in Germany. I believe, is it at least twice, or was it 3 times here? 3? 3 times? Okay. And my guess would be it's a very similar pattern of ransomware getting in. USB sticks are a very common way in the US as well for malware to enter hospitals, which is a little strange, right? Because notice I didn't mention internet. You don't need the internet to have your machine compromised. Of course, if you have the internet, it's yet more of an attack surface, but you don't need a network for these medical devices to get compromised. In Melbourne, anyone from Australia? No? Okay. In Melbourne, their pathology department, pathology is where you do lab tests like blood testing. Well, they have Windows XP. So for free, they get all the Windows XP malware too. So when they got hit, they couldn't access their systems. They had to start processing all those lab samples manually. Now, the hospitals always say, oh, but patients were never put in harm's way. But do you really want to have a 30-year-old resident who's never used a paper system before, who's very used to using computers, suddenly being forced to do everything manually? The chance of a mistake is a lot higher because it's just not something they're used to doing. In Melbourne, they said, don't worry, we're restoring the remaining Windows XP computers. So I guess we'll wait and see when they get reinfected. Now, the reason for this is often complicated. It's often a complex interaction between both the hospital and the manufacturer. Why are you running Windows XP? Well, if you talk to a manufacturer, the manufacturers will say, well, the customer isn't asking for the new operating system and they're not willing to pay for it. Their business, so if they're going to offer more services and more maintenance, then they probably deserve to be paid. And then if you ask a hospital, they blame the manufacturer, saying they won't provide updates. There's a little bit of truth to all of that, and it's hard to generalize. There's some hospitals who are really good at this, and there's some manufacturers who are really good, but there are also some bad apples in both camps. In Michigan, I'm not sure if the news has come all the way outside the US, but we have lead water poisoning in one of our cities. It's pretty bad. Number of, actually it could be hundreds if not thousands of children are going to be affected because they've been drinking leaded water for multiple years now. So hacktivists, or perhaps anonymous, decided to take down the local hospital. I don't know all the details, but the systems weren't available to deliver care for some time. Okay. Does this sound for real? 2,000 x-rays stolen to somewhere in China. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Have you heard about this? Or are you just guessing yes? Okay. So this is true, and we don't know exactly why. But remember, you saw the video earlier of John Halamka. John and I were together in Texas just, I think, 3 days ago at South by Southwest. And he explained that these x-rays were found in China, and he's not sure why, but he's pretty sure that the reason why they were stolen was that something having to do with certain laws, basically having to show a clean bill of health for certain kind of privileges. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he thinks it is. So I guess be skeptical. But he believes that there's a black market for some of these clean x-rays. Another example. Has Angry Birds taken down a hospital? Who's, I don't know, anyone from Finland? Okay, those Finns. This is true, but it wasn't actually the authentic Angry Birds binary. So as John Halamko was explaining to me, there was a nurse in the hospital who decided to download Angry Birds, and she happened to find it on a website in Bulgaria. Downloaded it, installed it. I don't know why. I mean, there must be a signature check, right? But, oh, maybe it was Windows. And it installed a screen scraper, a bunch of malware. Among other things, it ended up sending over 1 million spams from harvard.edu to different people all over the world, and it ended up blacklisting the entire Harvard campus with the spam, all because of Angry Birds. By the way, according to John, 31% of Harvard professors responded to phishing so that they would just click on links. Actually, I just got a phishing email this morning from a safety expert on medical devices in the UK, but I won't identify him. I probably just de-anonymized him. Okay, a hospital downgraded from SSH to Telnet. Why? Okay, this has got to be true, right? Because it just sounds too good not to be true. Sadly, this is actually the case. So it's very common for hospitals to scan for vulnerabilities. Certainly in a normal company, you'll scan for vulnerabilities to look for problems. In a hospital, it's a little bit more tricky because the networks tend to be more diverse. They tend to have more isolated sort of enclaves of different medical devices. And also, they have to be careful not to accidentally tip over medical devices that are being used on live patients. The last thing you want is to do a Nessus scan against an infusion pump that's currently delivering medicine. Okay. Anyhow, it turned out that one of these scanning tools had produced a report saying, "Oh, this particular machine has an outdated cipher suite in your SSH server. This is a problem." They couldn't do much about that because that's what's in the product. But they discovered, because this generated a trouble ticket for every single problem that was identified from the scanner, and they needed to close all the trouble tickets, compliance, they discovered that if they disable the SSH server and then enable Telnet and turn on a firewall, then the scanner doesn't identify it anymore as a problem. So now, the technical people are really smart, but let me just say the tools today are not very sharp for vulnerability scanning in clinical environments. They're designed very well for enterprises, and I'm going to guess many of you are security consultants who go in and do this. It's a lot harder in a hospital. So come talk with me if you want to get into that business, and I can tell you a little bit more. So yes, vulnerability scanning can knock over medical devices. It's kind of rare for Nmap to do it, but Nessus will. Basically, if the tools are used haphazardly, they can cause problems with live care. And moreover, if you walk into a hospital and you go down to the biomedical engineering department or the clinical engineering department and you say, "I'd like to do a scan of these devices, my company was just hired to ensure security," the biomeds will basically give you the finger. And they'll say, "Go away, you're gonna just slow things down here." And that is true. They are right. You will slow things down. You will mess things up if you don't understand the clinical environment. To give you an example, I'll just show you a quick video here of what happens when you do a live fuzz testing over the network, not using any kind of fancy tools, but just over the network. Here's a pacemaker programmer.
There it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So that was just over the network. And this is not particular to this device. You'll find a lot of devices when fuzzed can lead to very simple problems of the system's just not running. So can you imagine if you're in the middle of an operation and your computer just freezes? What do you do? Reboot, yeah, exactly. So the clinicians are just trained to reboot the machine. I found one adverse event report in the MAUDE database, this database of events at FDA, that explained a patient was undergoing radiology imaging, and the Windows machine started rebooting. So all the clinicians went to go treat the Windows machine. Meanwhile, in the cavity, in the tube, the patient went into cardiac arrest and no one noticed. The patient died. Now, you can't say that Windows killed the patient, but it definitely distracted the clinicians to the point where they didn't even think about patient care. And that's the real issue. It's not about hackers. It's not about some evil person trying to cause a targeted attack. It's really about distractions. It's really about interruption of that clinical workflow or those devices just not being available to deliver care. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I think I got about 25 minutes left. That's right. Talk a little bit about ways forward. Now, a lot of these are non-technical, but you'll find that some of the non-technical things are going to be the most effective in the clinical world. I'll actually pass around one little fun device. So this is actually from a company that I started with some of my former students. It's an anomaly detecting power outlet. So yeah, you'll have to think of it as, this is our silly American plug, right? But it detects anomalies through power consumption patterns. It also detects malware. So one of the more fun things, and I'll just give you a demo in a second, is showing how this device, and you can pass it around the room, as long as it comes back, will actually detect credit card scrapers and crypto locker breaking into medical devices. The reason why these kinds of what I would call more usable, it's usable because you don't have to modify the device being secured. It's one of these weird sweet spots. Usually you want to be able to build security in and not bolt it on after the fact, but every now and then you can find ways to build security on after the fact. And this is one of those examples for the detection capabilities for anomalies going on. Everything ranging, again, from malware to ball bearings wearing out without having to touch a single line of code. And it's operating system agnostic. Doesn't matter if it's custom embedded, Windows XP, OS2, it just works. So let me give you a demonstration of how this works, because it does probably sound like black magic. My colleague Dennis is going to narrate this, but what we have going on is on the right is a radiology imaging platform. You can see we have some x-rays pulled up. That's going to be our victim machine that gets infected with malware. And on the left is a debugging interface for software engineers showing you certain spectrograms of what's going on with our device. You can see an earlier prototype of that same thing floating around that is connected to the power brick of the notebook computer. It has no network connection to the computer. There's nothing binary. It only sees the analog power line.
Back on the protected asset, you can interact with this. You can run even other applications like a.
This is showing that even when you're normally running it, the false positives don't start popping up.
And even high CPU or CPU intensive applications, something like this, just like a busy loop. And while you're doing all of this, the analytics here still shows that it's clear. Notice
it's showing it's clear because we're not looking at how much power you consume. Instead, we're looking at the Fourier transform, and we're using machine learning to look at the patterns of power that you consume. As you copy things to and from DRAM to other cells of DRAM, you emit very interesting side channels onto the power line. When you turn off a GPU, very interesting things happen on the power line.
And we're going to copy this piece of software here. Now,
we labeled a piece of software on this USB stick Ebola Safety Protocol from CEO, open immediately.
And a number of other retailers last year. It's called Backoff.
So Backoff is a piece of malware that scrapes for credit cards. It searches through computer memory sequentially, looking for anything that appears to be a credit card number. And when it finds it, it wraps it up and then delivers it to a command and control server.
The current executable from this point. Now it's in memory, and it's starting to interact.
So remember, I mentioned that memory has very interesting power consumption. Every time you move a bit from memory, you can see it on the power line.
If you're interacting with the software, it doesn't seem like anything is happening on your side, and you can go ahead and continue interacting with your piece of software normally. in the background, back on our analytics engine.
So this is a very different way of thinking. This is not a replacement to antivirus. This is more of a place where if you have a device that's embedded and you can't do antivirus, well, you don't really have any other choice.
That indicates
but it's not a binary decision.
Getting redder. Gets to a point where it is so bad that it will send me a text, and then here we go. I just received a text that said that we received.
Yeah. So what's kind of interesting, though, for this particular piece of malware, backoff, not only does it know that something weird went wrong, but it knows that it's backoff. The other weird thing is we trained on an earlier variant of backoff, and it even caught a future variant of backoff because it's behavior-based rather than signature-based. It looks for the outcomes rather than whatever computer code was written. It just looks to see if those patterns match something we've seen before. But it's a very different way of thinking about malware and anomalies because I liken it to something more like a thermometer. So it's basically a thermometer for a computer. It's not necessarily going to tell you, it's not necessarily going to cure your disease, but it's going to tell you if you're the security guy in the hospital and you've got 50,000 devices, you want to know which one to go to this morning, you go where the thermometer tells you something's running a little hot. So this helps direct people, the experts, to spend their time more wisely on the devices that appear to be misbehaving. The other fun thing we do at Verta, the company we're at, is we make coffee. Any coffee roasters in the audience? Home roasters? Okay, I see one coffee nerd. Okay. This is a real letdown. You're not European. I'm sorry. I thought Europeans would be better at coffee. But so we make our own coffee at Verta. This particular blend I call Conficker coffee. It's a maliciously delicious single varietal from the Sulawesi region of Indonesia and roasted to full city plus, sure to keep you up while cleaning out Conficker from your cath labs. And the reason why we did this was a cath lab got infected with Conficker. A cath lab is a very specialized cardiology lab. It's, for instance, where you'll hear people talk about time to balloon. Time to balloon is when you have a blockage in your cardiac tissue and you need to get that out. They're going to run a catheter through your body and open a balloon to remove that blockage, to help remove blockage, or maybe put in a stent. These are the kind of labs that are very time sensitive. And so when Conficker broke into the cath lab, they weren't able to use the machines in the cath lab, and they had to redirect patients to other hospitals. Anyhow. So wrapping up, or starting to wrap up, and then we can take some questions. I can say if you want to know more about this space, I personally want to see a lot more people from the IT security community helping hospitals because they need a lot of help. But in order to help them, you really need to understand clinical workflow, which takes a lot of time. You can't pick this up from a book. Speaking of picking things up from a book, if you remember that earlier photograph of the pacemaker with the wire that would go through the armpit to twist a potentiometer, so I learned about that from reading. I went to go talk with the manufacturer, and they said, well, here's what you won't read about in the book. The real reason that we started to go more toward wireless, it is true, is because of infection, but why would people be getting infected in the first place? Well, it turns out that couples of a certain age who need to turn up their heart rate in the evenings will just look for any object possible, screwdrivers, stick it in there, try to get that heart rate up, and that leads to infections. So make sure you learn about things more than just by reading books. If you're going into a hospital, realize that it's very easy to break the infrastructure. They're going to be very hesitant to let you go in and even do a vulnerability scan. If you want to know more about how to get around that, certainly come talk with me after my talk. I'll be glad to give you some tips. But I can tell you that the hospitals really do want help. They're just a little afraid to work with people who don't have any experience in the clinical environment. If you're a manufacturer, let's say you manufacture SCADA systems, those are typically the kind of systems that you don't want to have toppled over by a vulnerability scan. I can also give you some tips afterwards if you want to know about how to avoid accidentally sort of bringing down a system during random scanning for vulnerabilities. It's okay to have vulnerabilities. We're filled. We're basically bags of bacteria and viruses. It's okay to have vulnerabilities as long as you're going to have compensating controls. But of course, it's not okay to pretend you don't have vulnerabilities and not scan systems. A very common thing you'll find in hospitals is you'll hear, oh, you can scan anything you want except the important devices. So they'll know everything about all the really boring stuff that have no consequences to life, and they will know very little about everything that matters most. Now, from a risk perspective, that makes no sense. But the reason why this is true is there aren't enough IT people who understand clinical culture, and the tools are just not sharp enough yet from the IT community. I was mentioning earlier, I run an annual workshop called Archimedes. It's the Archimedes Center for Medical Device Security. Archimedes is an acronym. It stands for the Archimedes Center for Medical Device Security. So we've been holding this for a few years. We bring in people from the manufacturing community, as well as the regulators, as well as clinicians who are very active in protecting devices used in their facilities. The most interesting talk I saw, it's all off the record, so there's non-attribution, but the most interesting talk I saw was by one chief information security officer from a large hospital who said, I'm going to present to you a whole bunch of vulnerabilities we haven't published before, and he encrypted the names of all the medical device manufacturers by removing the vowels. And the manufacturer's head of global product security was sitting in the front row. And so he was literally telling the vulnerability right to the guy who could have the most impact. And so that's why you hold this workshop. You don't have to go through the sales engineer. And anytime you go through sorry for any sales engineers in the room, but if you try to go through sales, it's much harder to end up getting into engineering to report some kind of problem. But there are a lot of problems. Let me just give you one more interesting problem to show you that manufacturers are not the bad guys. I was advising one manufacturer of patient monitors. These are the bedside devices in the hospital that monitor your vital signs, like your heart rate. They were using, I believe, WPA. This was a couple years ago. They got rid of WEP. So who likes WEP? Oh, okay. Hey, guys, somebody take them out. So they upgraded their patient monitors from using WEP to using WPA, which is a little bit better. They deployed it, and then they started getting feedback from their customers. One hospital said, hey, we kind of have this old infrastructure in our hospital, and it only works on WEP. How dare you, require that we upgrade to WPA? We want the old WEP system. And so the manufacturer, who was trying to do the right thing for computer security, then sort of said, darn it, we don't, we're only so many people. We can't just support all these different features. We have to support the common denominator. So they downgraded to WEP. The manufacturer wanted to do the right thing, but because they sort of were left to their worst customer, they ended up downgrading the security of their product. So hospitals are not exactly innocent all the time. But to wrap up, medical device security research, if you want to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter there. I post funny stories and jokes and photographs. But I'd say there's only one thing missing from this, and that's you are. So I really encourage people to get involved with medical device security. It is a hard area, but it's an important area with a lot of problems that when you solve these problems, you're actually going to be helping people for better health care. I guess I'll just wrap up there, and I'll do an advertisement for Marie. Marie will be speaking later this afternoon about pacemaker security, I believe. Or is it defibrillator security? Pacemaker security. But I think I will end there and be glad to take any questions in the remaining 10 minutes or so. But thank you. Oh. All right. Thanks for the power outlet. All right.
So thank you very much for this interesting talk. Are there any questions? We have some time left. Yep.
Guys, I see that the object, the power lamp.
Oh, this?
Yeah, have a jack. So you also test this over vulnerability, so you have a stress test, you find something.
I'm not sure what so you're asking me if I stress test something.
If you make a vulnerability scan over the device.
So let's see if this answers your question. But the reason why we have an Ethernet here is that many hospitals, although they have wireless, in many places they don't. And so you often find devices still using Ethernet. Just like you'll find pacemaker programmers still running OS/2. You'll find medical record systems running on IBM AIX. You'll find a lot of old technology. I know one hospital that has Windows 95 because it runs on an MRI, and in order to upgrade the operating system, they have to buy a new magnet. So you'll often find the old, Ethernet.
That's a question. Can you plug into the network? You try, because we are talking about that a lot of medical electronics can go out if you try to make a scan, or you try to make a vulnerability scan. So you test it to not, I don't know, break, go down, shut down when you make a scan. Or
So,
report any
I see.
that can use, I don't know, plug out the machine because you're using this.
So this device is only a listening device. It's a thermometer, and the thermometer doesn't generate traffic. So we don't generate any traffic or try to look at the Ethernet. However, as you're thinking, it's designed to work in concert with other tools. So it's designed to work with other scanning tools, for instance, because this is just one tool you would put in your arsenal to improve the security posture of your network, especially when you have embedded devices all over the network.
What if I think to attack that device?
Oh, to attack it. Yeah, okay, yeah.
So, I don't know, try to make a denial and find any code or make it reboot.
Oh, yeah, you can make it reboot. Actually, one of the interesting things about these devices is in order to pass some of the testing, in the US, we usually use UL. In Europe, I understand CE is more common. You have to show sort of fail-safe so that this thing's actually designed to be bled on, among other things. But it actually works independent of the software. So that
So it's not in line with the whole.
Correct. So you don't have to worry about it turning it off. There is no switch. There is no switch. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Further questions?
I don't know whether I understood you right. Are you affiliated with Virta, with the producers of these devices?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you are. Okay.
Next question?
So in the US, did the hospitals that were hacked move their patients to another hospital, or did they just stay, or how do they decide what's the necessary system? Or
Yeah, so I know that Presbyterian Hospital in California, so I don't know what it is in Germany, but in the US it's called 911, emergency phone calls. What is it in Germany?
112.
112? Okay. So what they did was they redirected all 911 calls to other hospitals. Now, I'm told by my colleagues who are more on the clinical side that actually works pretty well. If you automatically redirect patients to a nearby hospital, it tends not to delay things. However, the obvious problem is you end up with overload situations in other facilities. So I was in one hospital last month in Michigan where patients were lined up in the hallway because they had one of those events where there were just more patients than rooms. And when you only have so many clinicians, you do what's called triage. You treat certain patients depending upon their conditions first. I think there was a question. Oh, yep. Yes?
So as an expert on medical device security, what do you think is like the most pressing problem at the moment? What do we need to fix first to get things better?
So what's the biggest problem right now with medical device security? I think the biggest problem is we don't have sharp tools. No individual is able to do their job because in order to get things secured, you need cooperation from manufacturers, you need cooperation from regulators, you need cooperation from hospitals. And so I think the biggest advancement right now is going to be the sort of dirt simple stuff. We're not talking fancy crypto. I mean, crypto's important and it's part of the equation, but really basic stuff. For instance, just being able to detect a vulnerability, or just being able to detect a threat, excuse me. It's something that people just can't do right now in embedded devices. At least I'm not aware of any tools. We do have things like antivirus. We have things like network intrusion detection. But what do you do for things that aren't on networks? I don't know of anything. I think so being more aware of the risk is going to be helpful, because if you know about the risk, you can choose which risks to accept temporarily. You can choose which risks that you need to mitigate right away. And until we have that kind of data, we're going to be in this age of just, imagine you're a CIO or a CISO and you're a non-technical person. You're told you need to secure your hospital. You're probably just going to pick up a magazine and look for something that looks nice and just buy some things and put them in your hospital. To me, that's a very ad hoc way of doing things and just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. I think we need a little more science, more cohesion. So sharper tools is the short answer.
Further questions? Okay. Then thanks again for this eye-opening talk.
All right. Thank you.